The downtown courthouse bustled with its usual morning activity, a steady stream of people filing through security checkpoints and metal detectors. Among them was a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a simple navy pantsuit, her natural hair pulled back neatly. She carried herself with quiet confidence as she made her way through the building's imposing marble corridors. This particular morning was supposed to be routine. She was there to testify about a minor traffic incident. The officer who had pulled her over 2 months ago had been unnecessarily aggressive, and she had filed a formal complaint. Now, she sat patiently in the courtroom, waiting for her case to be called. The officer in question stood at the front of the courtroom, looking completely at ease in his pressed uniform. He had been on the force for 15 years and had developed a reputation for being particularly harsh with certain members of the community. Today, he seemed almost amused by the proceedings, occasionally sharing quiet jokes with his colleagues. When her case was finally called, the woman rose gracefully and approached the stand. The officer's smirk grew wider as she was sworn in. He clearly thought this would be another easy win, another complaint he could brush off without consequence. "Ma'am," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you claim I was unprofessional during our interaction. But isn't it true that you refused to show your ID immediately when requested?" The woman's expression remained neutral as she replied, "I asked to see your badge number first, which is my right as a citizen." "You refused and immediately became hostile." The officer chuckled, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, these types of complaints are becoming all too common. People watch a few videos online and suddenly think they're legal experts." The woman adjusted her posture, several inappropriate comments about my appearance, and refused to provide your badge number when requested. All of this is documented in the dashcam footage, which I've submitted as evidence. The officer's face had drained of color. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by visible anxiety. He kept glancing at his supervisor, who was now frowning deeply. The woman maintained her professional composure as she detailed the incident. She described how the officer had tailgated her for several blocks before pulling her over, how he had approached her vehicle with his hand on his weapon despite her calm compliance, and how he had made several disparaging remarks about her car and appearance. "This isn't about a single traffic stop," she explained to the judge. "It's about a pattern of behavior that erodes public trust in law enforcement. As someone who has dedicated their life to upholding the law, I believe we have a responsibility to hold ourselves to the highest standards of professional conduct." The courtroom remained silent as she spoke, her words carrying extra weight given her credentials. The officer, who had been so dismissive earlier, now stood rigid, his earlier arrogance replaced by the dawning realization that this routine traffic court appearance had just become something much more serious. This was just the beginning of what would become a thorough investigation into the officer's conduct record, revealing a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. The woman's decision to come forward would ultimately lead to significant changes in the department's training and oversight procedures, proving that sometimes the most powerful moments of justice come from unexpected places. In the days following the courthouse revelation, the police department found itself under an uncomfortable spotlight. The FBI agent's testimony had triggered a chain of events that nobody had anticipated, least of all the officer who had made that fateful traffic stop. The agent's superior at the FBI field office reviewed the incident with great interest. "This wasn't just about one traffic stop," she explained to her colleagues during a briefing. "It's about accountability and the trust gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve." She spread out a series of files across the conference table, each containing similar complaints against the same officer spanning the past 5 years. The police chief, a veteran of 30 years, sat in his office reviewing the dashcam footage for the 4th time. Each viewing revealed something new, subtle hints of bias, unnecessary escalation, and a clear abuse of authority. The chief removed his glasses and rubbed his temples, knowing that this incident would force his department to confront issues they'd been avoiding for far too long. Meanwhile, the officer found himself reassigned to desk duty pending investigation. The comfortable routine of his daily patrols was replaced by the monotony of paperwork and the whispers of colleagues. Some supported him, viewing the situation as an overreaction, while others maintained a careful distance, sensing the shifting tides within the department. The FBI agent continued her regular duties, but her inbox filled with emails from other community members sharing similar experiences. One afternoon, as she sorted through these messages, her phone rang. It was a senior official from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. "We've been monitoring similar patterns in other precincts," the official explained. "Your case might be the catalyst we needed to implement broader reforms." The agent listened intently, taking careful notes as they discussed the possibility of using this incident as a case study for police departments nationwide. The local community response was equally significant. Community leaders who had been raising concerns about police conduct for years finally felt heard. A respected community organizer, who had been documenting similar incidents for the past decade, reached out to the FBI agent. "What you did in that courtroom," she told the agent during their meeting at a local coffee shop, "was confirm what we've been saying all along. But coming from you, they couldn't dismiss it." They spent hours discussing the systemic issues facing the community and potential solutions that could bridge the trust gap. The police department's Internal Affairs Division, now under pressure to conduct a thorough investigation, began interviewing other officers who had worked with the accused officer. The testimonies painted a complex picture of departmental culture. Junior officers spoke about the unwritten rules they were expected to follow, the pressure to maintain certain arrest quotas, and the subtle encouragement of aggressive policing in certain neighborhoods. One young officer, barely 2 years into the job, provided particularly telling testimony. "We were taught to view every situation as potentially dangerous," she explained. "But somewhere along the line, that caution turned into prejudice for some officers. We lost sight of the fact that we're here to serve and protect everyone equally." The FBI agent's task force began compiling data from multiple sources: civilian complaints, arrest records, body camera footage, and departmental records. Patterns emerged that couldn't be ignored. The evidence showed a clear disparity in how certain communities were being policed, with the officer in question being just one example of a broader systemic issue. The police chief called an emergency meeting with his command staff. The room was tense as they reviewed the preliminary findings. "We have 2 choices," he announced, looking at each person around the table. "We can either fight this and lose the public's trust entirely, or we can use this as an opportunity to become the department our community deserves." The chief's words resonated with many of his officers, particularly the younger ones who had entered law enforcement with idealistic views about making a difference. They began sharing their own ideas for reform, from improved de-escalation training to community engagement programs. As weeks passed, the initial shock of the courthouse confrontation evolved into something more constructive. The FBI agent found herself invited to speak at police training sessions, sharing her unique perspective as both a law enforcement officer and a member of the community that had experienced biased policing. During one such session, she stood before a class of police cadets, her presence commanding attention. "The badge we wear isn't a shield from accountability," she explained. "It's a symbol of the public's trust. Every interaction we have, whether it's a major crime or a simple traffic stop, either builds or erodes that trust." The officer who had sparked this chain of events watched his career hang in the balance as the investigation continued. His personnel file, now under scrutiny, revealed a history of complaints that had been dismissed or downplayed. Each incident, viewed individually, might have seemed minor, but together they told a story of unchecked bias and escalating misconduct. What had started as a simple traffic stop was transforming into a catalyst for change. The FBI agent's revelation in the courtroom had done more than just expose one officer's misconduct. It had cracked open the door for a deeper examination of systemic issues that had gone unaddressed for far too long. The story began spreading beyond the local jurisdiction, catching the attention of police departments and civil rights organizations across the country. It represented something bigger than one incident or one department. It was becoming a case study in how accountability and transparency could lead to meaningful reform in law enforcement. The morning of the formal hearing arrived with an unusual amount of media attention. Local news vans lined the street outside the police headquarters, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray morning sky. Inside, the hearing room buzzed with quiet tension as people took their seats. The FBI agent sat calmly at one of the tables, reviewing her notes one final time. Her presence had drawn attention from civil rights organizations across the state, and several of their representatives filled the rows behind her. The officer sat at the opposite table, his uniform pressed but his shoulders slightly hunched, the weight of the past few weeks visible in his demeanor. As the hearing began, the department's internal affairs investigator presented their findings. The evidence was methodically laid out: years of complaint patterns, statistical analyses of traffic stops, and testimony from both colleagues and community members. The dashcam footage from the agent's traffic stop played on the screen, the officer's condescending tone echoing through the silent room. Over the past 5 years, the investigator explained, displaying a series of graphs, this officer conducted traffic stops at a rate 3 times higher in minority neighborhoods compared to other areas, with a significantly higher rate of searches but a lower rate of actual contraband found. The FBI agent's testimony came next. She spoke not just about her personal experience, but about the broader implications for law enforcement. This isn't about punishing one officer, she explained, her voice steady and clear. It's about acknowledging a systemic problem and taking steps to address it. Every unprofessional interaction damages the relationship between law enforcement and the community we're sworn to protect. During a brief recess, reporters gathered in the hallway, discussing the implications of the case. A veteran police reporter from the local newspaper turned to his colleague and whispered, "In 20 years covering law enforcement, I've never seen anything quite like this, an FBI agent experiencing and documenting bias firsthand." When the officer finally took the stand, the room grew even quieter. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a mixture of defensiveness and uncertainty. "I've served this community for 15 years, he began, his voice slightly shaky. "I've always done what I thought was right to maintain law and order." The hearing board's questions were direct and uncompromising. They pressed him about specific incidents, his justification for certain actions, and his understanding of community relations. With each question, the gap between his perception of his actions and their actual impact became more apparent. "Looking at these statistics," one board member asked, "how do you explain the disparity in how you've treated different members of our community?" The officer struggled to provide a coherent answer, his previous justifications crumbling under careful scrutiny. During the lunch break, the FBI agent stood by a window, watching protesters gather outside with signs calling for police reform. A young officer approached her hesitantly. "I've been on the force for 2 years, she said quietly. "What you're doing, it's making a lot of us think differently about how we approach our work." The afternoon session brought testimony from community members. A high school teacher described being pulled over 3 times in 1 month without cause. A local business owner shared how repeated harassment had affected his family's sense of security. Their stories painted a picture of a community living under constant scrutiny and fear. The police chief sat through it all, his expression growing more concerned with each testimony. During one break, he was overheard telling his deputy, "We can't just treat this as an isolated incident. We need to look at our entire approach to community policing." As the hearing progressed, the officer's demeanor gradually shifted. The reality of how his actions had affected the community seemed to finally sink in. During his final statement, his voice carried a note of genuine reflection. "I never saw myself as biased," he admitted. "Maybe that was part of the problem. I never stopped to question why I made certain decisions or how they affected people." The FBI agent's final remarks resonated through the room. Change in law enforcement doesn't just happen through policies and procedures, she stated. It happens when we have the courage to confront our biases, acknowledge our mistakes, and actively work to rebuild trust. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every decision we make carries the weight of our entire profession's reputation. Outside the hearing room, community organizers huddled with local officials, discussing the possibility of creating a civilian oversight board. The incident had opened up new channels of dialogue between law enforcement and community leaders that had previously seemed impossible. The media coverage expanded beyond the local news, with national outlets picking up the story. Headlines focused not just on the dramatic revelation in traffic court, but on the larger implications for police reform and accountability across the country. As the sun set on the final day of the hearing, the board went into deliberation. The FBI agent gathered her materials, knowing that regardless of the outcome, the case had already sparked important changes. The officer sat alone at his table, the reality of his situation evident in his posture. The ripple effects of that single traffic stop had grown into waves of change, touching not just one department or community, but contributing to a national conversation about law enforcement reform. The story had become more than just an incident of accountability. It was evolving into a case study of how systematic change could begin with a single moment of truth. The hearing board's deliberation lasted longer than anyone expected. As the sun rose the next morning, news of their decision spread quickly through the department and community. The officer would not be terminated, but instead would face a lengthy suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, and a permanent reassignment to a community engagement unit, if he chose to stay on the force. The decision sparked mixed reactions. Some activists argued it wasn't harsh enough, while others saw it as an opportunity for meaningful reform. The FBI agent, reviewing the full decision document in her office, noticed something unprecedented. The board had recommended a complete overhaul of the department's training and oversight procedures. This isn't just about punishment, the board's chairperson explained during the press conference. It's about transformation. We're implementing a new system where officers will be regularly evaluated not just on their arrest records, but on their community engagement and de-escalation successes. The police chief wasted no time implementing changes. Within weeks, a new civilian oversight committee was formed, comprising community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and former law enforcement officials. The FBI agent was invited to serve as a special advisor, bringing her unique perspective to the reform process. During the first committee meeting, heated discussions filled the room. A community leader pounded her fist on the table, her voice filled with emotion. "We need more than just promises this time," she insisted. "We need concrete actions and real accountability." The FBI agent listened carefully before speaking. "Change happens in steps," she explained. "But those steps need to be measurable and meaningful." She pulled out a detailed proposal for a new officer evaluation system that would track patterns in traffic stops, use of force, and community feedback. Meanwhile, the officer at the center of it all began his journey through the department's new rehabilitation program. His first assignment was to attend community meetings, not as a speaker, but as a listener. He sat quietly in the back row, hearing stories from residents about their experiences with law enforcement. One evening, after a particularly moving testimony from a local father about his fears for his teenage sons, the officer requested to speak. The room fell silent as he stood. "I've worn this badge for 15 years, he began, his voice humble, "but I'm just now starting to understand what it truly means to protect and serve everyone equally." The department's training academy became ground zero for reform. New modules on implicit bias were introduced, led by experts in psychology and civil rights law. Veteran officers were required to attend alongside recruits, creating conversations that bridged generational gaps in law enforcement approaches. The FBI agent's influence extended beyond the local department. She began receiving invitations to speak at police academies across the state. Her presentations always started with the dashcam footage from her traffic stop, using it as a launching point to discuss larger issues of bias and accountability. During one such presentation, a seasoned instructor approached her afterward. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "we've been teaching procedure for years, but we've never really addressed the human element like this. It's changing how our cadets view their future role." Back in the community, changes were becoming visible. Officers began attending neighborhood events out of uniform, participating in local sports leagues, and hosting monthly coffee meetings with residents. The barriers between law enforcement and the community started to slowly dissolve. The officer who had sparked this transformation struggled with his new role initially. The community engagement unit was far from his comfort zone of patrol work. However, as weeks passed, something unexpected happened. He began to form genuine connections with community members he had once viewed with suspicion. One afternoon, he found himself coaching a youth basketball program in the same neighborhood where he had once conducted aggressive patrols. As he watched the kids play, a parent approached him. "I remember when you used to patrol here," she said. "The change in you, it gives us hope that real change is possible." The FBI agent continued her regular duties but kept close tabs on the department's progress. During a review meeting 6 months after the hearing, she presented data showing a significant decrease in complaint filings and use of force incidents. "This is what accountability looks like," she told the Oversight Committee. "It's not just about catching wrongdoing, it's about preventing it." The story caught the attention of police reform advocates nationwide. Departments from other states began sending observers to study the transformation. The model of reform, sparked by a single traffic stop and an FBI agent's courage to speak up, was becoming a blueprint for change. 1 year after the initial courthouse revelation, the department hosted a community forum to discuss the progress of reforms. The room was packed with residents, officers, and media representatives. The atmosphere was different from the tense meetings of the past. There was an air of cautious optimism. The FBI agent sat in the audience, watching as community members and officers engaged in genuine dialogue. The officer she had confronted in traffic court was there too, now speaking about his own journey of transformation and the importance of acknowledging bias. As the forum concluded, a young officer cadet approached the FBI agent. "Your story is part of our training now," she said. "It teaches us that wearing a badge doesn't make us above the law, it makes us more responsible to uphold it fairly." The changes weren't perfect, and challenges remained, but something fundamental had shifted. A single moment of accountability had grown into a movement for lasting reform, proving that change was possible when courage met opportunity, and when truth spoke to power. 18 months after the courthouse confrontation, the police department had become a case study in successful reform. A national law enforcement conference was being held in the city, and departments from across the country had gathered to learn from their transformation. The FBI agent, now recognized as a catalyst for change, was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. The conference center buzzed with activity as police chiefs, officers, and civil rights advocates filled the auditorium. The officer who had once mocked her in traffic court sat in the front row, now serving as a trainer in the department's reformed community engagement program. His journey had become an integral part of their story. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures. The FBI agent began her speech, her voice carrying through the hushed room. Sometimes it comes from standing up in small moments, from refusing to let bias go unchallenged, from being willing to face uncomfortable truths. She shared statistics that painted a compelling picture of transformation. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60%. Use of force incidents were down by 45%. But more importantly, community trust scores had risen dramatically. The department's recruitment now reflected the diversity of the community it served. During a break in the conference, a group of officers from various cities gathered in the hallway, sharing their own experiences. "We thought our department was doing fine," one chief admitted. "But seeing these results, we realize how much room for improvement we have." The officer who had sparked this chain of events now led a workshop on recognizing and overcoming bias. His presentation style was markedly different from his former patrol demeanor, humble, thoughtful, and deeply aware of the impact officers have on their communities. "I used to think authority meant having power over people," he told the room. "Now I understand it means having a responsibility to people." His words resonated particularly with veteran officers who recognized their own biases in his story. In the community, the changes had taken root in unexpected ways. Local businesses that once posted "No Cops" signs now hosted monthly community police dialogue sessions. Youth programs flourished, with officers coaching sports teams and mentoring students. The us versus them mentality that had dominated police-community relations for decades was slowly dissolving. The FBI Agents Task Force had expanded its scope, working with departments across the state to implement similar reforms. She had developed a comprehensive training program that combined technical skills with emotional intelligence and cultural competency. During one community meeting, an elderly resident stood up, tears in her eyes. "For the first time in my life," she said, "I feel safe calling the police when I need help. I never thought I'd see this day." Her words captured the profound impact of the changes that had taken place. The department's new hiring practices were making headlines. Psychological evaluations now included extensive bias screening. Training incorporated real-world scenarios focused on de-escalation and community engagement. The Academy's curriculum had been completely revamped with input from civil rights experts and community leaders. The officer who had undergone such a dramatic transformation found himself mentoring new recruits. "Look at this badge," he would tell them, holding up his shield. "This isn't a symbol of power, it's a symbol of service. Never forget that." One afternoon, the FBI agent received an unexpected visitor in her office. It was the judge from the original traffic court hearing. "I've been watching what's happened since that day in my courtroom," the judge said. "You've started something remarkable here." The media attention had evolved from covering a singular incident to documenting a sustainable model of police reform. News crews from national networks visited regularly, capturing stories of positive police-community interactions and interviewing residents about the changes they'd witnessed. A documentary filmmaker had begun following the department's journey, capturing the ongoing transformation. During one interview, a rookie officer spoke about why she had chosen this department specifically. "I wanted to be part of something different," she explained. "Here, we're showing that law enforcement can change, that we can do better." The FBI agent's work had caught the attention of federal lawmakers. She was invited to testify before a congressional committee on police reform, sharing the department's success story as a model for national legislation. Her testimony focused not just on policies and procedures, but on the human element of law enforcement. Back in the community, the changes were visible in everyday interactions. Traffic stops, once a source of tension and fear, were now handled with professionalism and respect. Officers were required to provide business cards with their badge numbers and information about the civilian complaint process at every stop. The department had implemented a pioneering program where officers regularly spent time living in different neighborhoods within their jurisdiction, helping them understand the communities they served. This immersion program had proven particularly effective in breaking down stereotypes and building genuine connections. During a community festival, the contrast with the past was striking. Officers played basketball with local youth, shared meals with residents, and engaged in genuine conversations. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable were crumbling, replaced by bridges of understanding and respect. The officer who had once faced disciplinary action now spoke regularly at police academies across the country. His story of transformation had become a powerful testimony to the possibility of change. "I'm not proud of who I was," he would tell cadets, "but I'm proud of who I'm becoming." The FBI agent's initiative had sparked a movement that extended far beyond one department or community. It had demonstrated that meaningful police reform was possible when accountability met opportunity, when courage confronted bias, and when truth prevailed over tradition. 2 years after the traffic court incident, the impact of that single moment had reached far beyond anyone's expectations. The Department of Justice had taken notice, and a new national police reform initiative was being modeled after the changes implemented in this city. The FBI agent found herself at the center of a movement that was reshaping law enforcement across the country. On a crisp autumn morning, she stood before a gathering of international law enforcement officials who had come to learn about the American reform model. Representatives from police forces in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia filled the conference room, eager to understand how a confrontation in traffic court had led to such sweeping changes. The key was never about punishment, she explained to the attentive audience. It was about transformation. We didn't just change policies, we changed culture. She clicked through slides showing the dramatic improvements in community relations and officer satisfaction rates over the past 2 years. The original officer, now a respected reform advocate, shared the stage with her. Their joint presentations had become powerful testimonies to the possibility of change. I was the problem, he would admit openly. But I was also proof that the problem could be solved. Back in the community, the changes had become deeply rooted. Local schools had instituted a police youth partnership program where officers regularly participated in classroom discussions about law enforcement, civil rights, and community relations. The program had become so successful that neighboring cities were adopting it. During one such classroom session, a high school student raised her hand. My older brother used to tell me to run if I saw a police officer, she said. Now he's applying to the police academy because he wants to be part of this new way of doing things. The department's training program had evolved into a national center for excellence in community policing. Officers from across the country came to learn not just new procedures, but a new philosophy of law enforcement. The FBI agent's curriculum emphasized emotional intelligence and cultural awareness alongside traditional police skills. One morning, while reviewing applications for the next training cohort, the FBI agent received an unexpected call. A major police department on the West Coast was facing a crisis similar to what her city had experienced 2 years ago. They wanted her to consult on their reform process. Your situation isn't unique, she told their command staff during a video conference. But your opportunity to change is. The question is whether you have the courage to face these issues honestly. Her words struck a chord, and soon she was flying out to help them implement their own reform program. The original department had become a living laboratory for police reform. Researchers from prestigious universities conducted studies on their transformation, documenting the factors that had made their changes successful where other reform attempts had failed. During a community feedback session, an elderly gentleman stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. I've lived in this city for 70 years, he said. For the first time in my life, I see police officers as guardians of our community, not just enforcers of the law. The officer who had once faced disciplinary action had completed a remarkable journey. He now headed the department's newly created Office of Community Accountability, where he worked to ensure that the reforms remained strong and effective. His personal transformation had become a symbol of hope for other officers struggling with change. One afternoon, he sat down with a group of veteran officers who were resistant to the new approaches. I understand your fears, he told them. I lived with those same fears for 15 years. But let me tell you what freedom feels like: freedom from bias, freedom from anger, freedom to truly serve and protect everyone equally. The FBI agent's work had caught the attention of civil rights organizations nationwide. She was invited to join a presidential task force on law enforcement reform, where she advocated for implementing similar changes across all federal law enforcement agencies. During one task force meeting, a senior official questioned whether such sweeping changes were practical on a national scale. The FBI agent pulled up the data from her department. Look at these numbers, she said. Lower crime rates, higher solve rates, improved officer retention, and stronger community trust. This isn't just practical, it's essential. The local community had become a model for police-community relations. Regular town halls, once tense confrontations, had evolved into productive planning sessions where officers and residents worked together to address neighborhood concerns. The us versus them mentality had been replaced by a sense of shared responsibility for community safety. A documentary team capturing the department's journey filmed a powerful moment during a community basketball game. Officers and local youth played together while parents who had once warned their children to avoid police now cheered from the sidelines. The scene captured the profound cultural shift that had taken place. The officer who had sparked this change reflected on his journey during a mentoring session with new recruits. "I thought I was losing something when they took me off patrol," he admitted. "Instead, I found something I never knew I was missing, a real connection with the community I serve." The FBI agent's influence had extended into police academy curricula nationwide. Her emphasis on emotional intelligence and cultural competency had become standard components of officer training. Departments reported significant improvements in community relations where these new approaches were implemented. During a national law enforcement conference, a police chief from a major city approached her. "We've been trying to reform for years," he said. "But seeing your results, we realize we've been changing procedures without changing hearts. That's what we need to focus on." The success of the reforms had also influenced political discussions about law enforcement funding. Instead of calls to defund the police, there was now constructive dialogue about reallocating resources to support community-oriented policing initiatives and officer wellness programs. As the 2-year mark approached, the FBI agent sat in her office, reviewing the latest community satisfaction surveys. The numbers told a story of transformation that went beyond statistics. They reflected a fundamental change in how the police and community viewed and treated each other. The journey that had begun with a tense traffic stop had evolved into a movement that was reshaping the future of law enforcement. It proved that meaningful change was possible when courage, accountability, and commitment came together in service of a greater good. 3 years had passed since that fateful day in traffic court, and the ripples of change had grown into waves of transformation across the globe. The FBI agent found herself standing in front of the United Nations Committee on Law Enforcement and Human Rights, sharing how a single traffic stop had sparked an international movement in police reform. The conference hall in Geneva was packed with representatives from over 50 countries, all eager to learn from what had become known as the American Transformation Model. As she presented the 3-year data, the numbers spoke volumes. Community trust in law enforcement had risen to unprecedented levels, officer job satisfaction had improved dramatically, and crime rates had decreased through genuine community partnerships. Back home, the original department had become a living testament to sustainable change. The latest class of recruits was the most diverse in the department's history, with many applicants citing the reformed culture as their primary reason for choosing law enforcement as a career. During a training session for these new recruits, the officer who had once faced disciplinary action shared his story. "When I look at you," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I see the future of law enforcement. You're not here despite our past mistakes, you're here because we had the courage to face them." The FBI agent had developed a comprehensive digital platform that allowed departments worldwide to share best practices and lessons learned. One morning, while reviewing feedback on the platform, she received a message from a police chief in South Africa who had successfully implemented similar reforms in his department. "Your model showed us it was possible," he wrote. "But what really made the difference was understanding that change starts with individual officers acknowledging their biases and choosing to grow beyond them." The community's transformation had become equally remarkable. Local businesses that had once hired private security now partnered with the police department for community safety initiatives. Youth who had grown up fearing law enforcement were now entering the police academy, bringing with them valuable perspectives on community needs. During a community forum, a grandmother stood up to share her story. 3 years ago, I wouldn't let my grandchildren play in the front yard if I saw a police car in the neighborhood, she said, wiping away tears. Now, those same officers know my grandkids by name and stop to play basketball with them. The department's success had led to the creation of a new federal grant program supporting similar reforms across the country. The FBI agent found herself advising the committee overseeing these grants, ensuring that funding went to departments truly committed to meaningful change. Money alone doesn't create change, she explained during a congressional hearing. It has to be paired with genuine commitment to transformation at every level of law enforcement. Her testimony helped shape new federal guidelines for police funding that tied financial support to measurable reform outcomes. The officer who had sparked this journey had become a respected authority on police reform. He traveled to departments facing similar challenges, sharing his personal story of transformation. "I was the officer who thought I was doing my job by being tough," he would tell them. "Now I understand that true strength lies in building trust, not fear." Research universities had begun documenting the long-term effects of the reforms. A comprehensive study showed that departments adopting the model saw significant improvements not only in community relations but also in officer mental health and family life. The study revealed that when officers felt connected to their communities, they experienced less stress and made better decisions in critical situations. One afternoon, the FBI agent received an unexpected visitor, a young woman who had recently graduated from the police academy. "I was 16 when you exposed that officer's bias," she said. "Watching how things changed in our community made me want to be part of this new generation of officers." The department's training center had evolved into an international hub for police reform. Officers from countries as diverse as Brazil, Japan, and Sweden came to learn not just procedures, but the underlying philosophy of community-centered law enforcement. During one international training session, a senior officer from London shared his perspective. "We thought American policing was beyond repair," he admitted. "But you've shown us that with the right approach, any department can transform itself." The original traffic court judge had become an advocate for judicial reform, encouraging courts nationwide to play a more active role in police accountability. "What we witnessed that day wasn't just about one traffic stop," he would say at legal conferences. "It was about the power of truth to catalyze change." The FBI agent's task force had expanded its scope to include research on preventing bias from taking root in law enforcement cultures. They developed early intervention programs that helped identify and address problematic behavior patterns before they became entrenched. One morning, while reviewing the latest community feedback reports, the agent received news that their model had been adopted by the European Union as a standard for police reform across member states. The transformation that began with a single act of courage had truly gone global. The department's community engagement programs had evolved beyond traditional police-community relations. Officers were now deeply embedded in neighborhood initiatives, from youth mentoring to elderly care programs. The boundary between police and community had become increasingly fluid, with each supporting the other's well-being. During a graduation ceremony for new officers, the FBI agent watched with pride as the diverse group of recruits took their oaths. These officers would begin their careers in a department already transformed by reform, carrying forward the lessons learned from past mistakes. As she prepared to leave the ceremony, a veteran officer approached her. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when all this started, many of us thought it would destroy law enforcement. Instead, it saved it. You helped us remember why we chose this profession in the first place." The story of transformation had become more than just a case study in police reform, it had become a blueprint for how institutions could acknowledge their flaws and work toward meaningful change. It proved that true reform required more than new policies, it required a fundamental shift in hearts and minds. 5 years had passed since that momentous day in traffic court. The FBI agent stood at her office window, watching new recruits training in the yard below. The department had become unrecognizable from what it had been half a decade ago, yet its transformation had only marked the beginning of a much larger journey. A special ceremony was being held that evening to commemorate the 5-year anniversary of the reforms. The community center was packed with faces both familiar and new, officers, community members, and visitors from around the world who had come to witness the lasting impact of what had started as a simple traffic stop. The officer who had once mocked her in court was now preparing to take on a new role as the department's chief of community relations. His journey from being the face of bias to becoming a champion of reform had inspired countless others in law enforcement to confront their own prejudices and embrace change. 5 years ago, I was the problem, he addressed the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Today, I stand before you not just as a changed person, but as living proof that transformation is possible when we have the courage to face our flaws and the humility to learn from them. The FBI agent had been invited to speak at the ceremony, but she chose instead to sit among the community members. Her simple act of standing up for justice had sparked a movement, but it was the collective effort of an entire community that had turned that spark into lasting change. A young officer, fresh from the academy, approached her during the reception. "You know," she said, "we study your traffic stop incident in training now. But it's not just about what happened that day, it's about what happened after, how an entire system changed because one person refused to accept injustice." The department's reform model had been adopted by law enforcement agencies in over 30 countries. The FBI agent's curriculum on bias recognition and community engagement had been translated into 12 languages. What had begun as a local initiative had evolved into a global standard for police reform. During the ceremony, a community elder stood to share his perspective. "I've lived through 7 decades of changes in this city," he said, his voice strong despite his years. "But nothing compares to what I've witnessed in the past 5 years. For the first time, I see police officers as part of our community, not separate from it." The statistics told a compelling story. Complaint rates had dropped by 80%, officer retention had improved dramatically, and community satisfaction scores were at historic highs. But the real success could be seen in the daily interactions between officers and residents, the casual conversations, the mutual respect, the genuine connections. The original traffic court judge attended the ceremony, now serving on a federal commission for judicial reform. "What we witnessed that day in court," he reflected, "wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about recognizing that true justice requires constant vigilance and the courage to speak truth to power." International delegations regularly visited the department to study their transformation. During one such visit, a police chief from Singapore observed, "You haven't just reformed a department, you've created a new model of what law enforcement can be in the 21st century." The FBI agents' task force had evolved into a permanent office within the FBI, dedicated to promoting and supporting law enforcement reform nationwide. Their work had helped reshape policies at every level, from local departments to federal agencies. Looking back, the agent realized that the most significant change wasn't in the policies or procedures, it was in the mindset of everyone involved. Officers no longer saw themselves as warriors against crime but as guardians of community well-being. Residents no longer viewed police with fear but as partners in creating safer neighborhoods. During the ceremony, a video montage played, showing the journey of transformation over the past 5 years. Images of tense confrontations gave way to scenes of community cooperation. The contrast was striking, a visual testament to how far they had come. The officer who had sparked this change watched the video with tears in his eyes. His journey from being a symbol of what was wrong with law enforcement to becoming an ambassador for reform had not been easy, but it had been transformative not just for him, but for the entire profession. A group of teenage students who had participated in the department's youth program performed a spoken-word piece about their changing perspective on law enforcement. Their words captured the profound shift in how the next generation viewed the role of police in their community. The FBI agent's phone buzzed with a message: another department across the country was reporting success with implementing the reform model. These messages had become regular occurrences, each one a reminder that change was possible anywhere there was willingness to embrace it. As the ceremony drew to a close, the current police chief made an announcement that brought the room to its feet. The department's training center would be renamed the Center for Community-Centered Law Enforcement, ensuring that the lessons learned would continue to shape future generations of officers. The FBI agent found herself surrounded by people sharing their stories of how the changes had affected their lives. Each story was unique, yet they all shared a common thread: the recognition that true security comes not from force or fear, but from mutual respect and understanding. Looking around the room, she saw the officer who had once confronted her chatting easily with community members, new recruits mingling with veteran officers, and residents of all backgrounds sharing their hopes for the future. This, she realized, was what real change looked like. As the evening wound down, a young girl approached the FBI agent with a drawing. It showed police officers and community members holding hands around a neighborhood. "This is how I see police now," she said simply, handing over her artwork. The journey that had begun with a tense traffic stop had transformed not just a department or a community, but had redefined what was possible in law enforcement reform. It proved that change, no matter how daunting it might seem, was always possible when courage met opportunity and truth spoke to power. The story had no real ending, for it continued to inspire new beginnings in departments and communities around the world. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities for growth, but the foundation had been laid for a future where law enforcement and community worked together as true partners in public safety.